Hello and welcome to Sync Music Matters, a podcast that explores the beautiful relationship between music and the moving image. My name's Jim Holstrip and I'm your host on this journey, as each week I chew the fat with industry professionals who, on a daily basis, work with music for visuals. Now you might immediately assume that I'm talking about composers, but I'm also talking about editors, music supervisors, directors, and anyone else who's involved with the synchronous process of pairing audio and visuals. Today I'm talking to TV, film and media composer and solo artist Danny Mulhern. So before I dive in and give you an overview of what you can expect from my chat with Danny Mulhern, I need to make an apology. All the music featured in the podcast is my own, but the theme tune, which you've just heard, is courtesy of the music publisher Audio Socket ASX, who have very kindly given me permission to use it as this sort of theme tune for the show. I can't quite believe I've managed to get to episode 7 without crediting them. So thank you, Audio Socket ASX. And that particular track is called Dark Arts, off the album of the same name. Going forward, I will ensure that any publisher who's kind enough to let me use music on the show will, of course, get full credit. So, Danny Mulhern. So Danny Mulhern is a pretty philosophical cat, and as such I was ready to go pretty deep with him, and we do. We talk about his use of improvisation and flow state as a creative tool for making music. We touch on flow state at several points throughout the interview, and for anyone who isn't familiar with flow state, it can be described as the mental state in which a person performing some activity is fully immersed in a feeling of energized focus. Energized focus. Well, that sounds good, doesn't it? But it's, the idea that we're kind of in the zone, we're immersed in something to a point where everything outside of that kind of ceases to exist. Powerful tool. We also talk about accessing the subconscious. I sounded very northern when I said that. Accessing the subconscious. We also look at overcoming procrastination, or what Stephen Pressfield in The War of Art refers to as resistance. Now, if you haven't read The War of Art, I highly recommend it. It's a great book for anyone who does anything remotely creative. But Stephen Pressfield talks about resistance, which is that thing that stops you being creative. We touch on imposter syndrome, which if you are a regular listener to the podcast, you'll know that many creatives suffer from. It seems definitely a recurring theme. And Danny very kindly shares about a time in his life where he very much fell out of love with music. He felt like he was doing it for the wrong reasons. But that love was rekindled through collaboration with other musicians and actually through human connection, which is a kind of really inspiring story. We talk about John Vervaeke, the cognitive psychologist, and the meaning crisis. Yep, told you we go deep. But it's also a project that Danny's actually involved with at the moment. In terms of going under the skin, we talk about a film that he scored, What They Had, starring Hilary Swank and Michael Shannon. And Danny essentially scored that film in the best part of 3 weeks, which was a phenomenal feat. We also get a taste for Danny's musical influences, which include the likes of Jimi Hendrix, the Beatles, and Ian McGilchrist. As ever, I link to all the people and the music that we talk about in the podcast. You can find that in the show notes of your preferred podcast platform, or you can pop on over to my website, larpmusic.com, click on podcasts, and you'll find all the links there. And a little ask from me. If you enjoy the podcast and are happy to do so, I would be hugely grateful if you could pop on over to Apple Podcasts and give it a rating and a review. It just helps with the algorithm and it tells the artificial intelligence, which will soon be running the world, that this podcast is worth listening to. Thanks a lot. Let's chat to Danny. Danny Mulhern is a composer, multi-instrumentalist and producer who, in addition to writing for TV and film, releases his own unique brand of instrumental music. Much of his recent work has been with the London Contemporary Orchestra on records and film scores, including the critically acclaimed What They Had, starring Hilary Swank, Michael Shannon and Robert Forster. Other film and TV scores include long-running BBC forensic crime drama Silent Witness, BBC wildlife documentary The Natural World, and entertainment shows with the likes of Derren Brown, Matt Lucas and Simon Pegg. Danny's own music is probably best described as contemporary classical with an ambient electronic crossover. To my mind, Danny's music is wonderfully textural, and he often plays with polyrhythms as he explores philosophical ideas around improvisation, intuition, and collective intelligence. Look out for his forthcoming album, Singing Through Others, which is inspired primarily by conversations around sense-making and the meaning crisis. Danny Mulhern, thanks for joining me.
Hey Jim, good to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
Yeah, it's interesting that you've worked on a show that Simon Pegg's been in, because I often think that you look a bit like Simon Pegg.
You're not the first person to say that, actually. I think even Marielle, my partner, said that when we first got together. I didn't take it as a compliment, but he's got a lot of charisma.
Absolutely, yeah. No, I think it very much so. But we never see you in the same room, so that's all I'm saying.
Yeah, I'm not gonna comment.
So, first question is, rewind to a young Danny Mulhern back in the day, sort of pre-10. If someone had asked you what you would like to be when you grow up, what would have been your response?
Oh Christ! Do I admit it? That's the question.
Yes.
The truthful answer actually is priest, but it's not for any kind of deep existential reasons. It's like, well, I was sort of brought up Catholic, and I did take it quite seriously actually. But there was this time, kind of when we were kids, everyone was watching. This is going to show my age. Everyone was watching Dallas and stuff, and there were these sort of 80s miniseries, and there was this one called The Thornbirds with Richard Chamberlain. And he was a sort of priest who had this love affair with this really lovely girl. And but he was also a successful priest. He became a cardinal and all this. And I thought, God, he's having his cake and eating it. Maybe I can.
He's a philandering priest. I want to be one of those.
He's a philandering priest, exactly.
Wow. And so was it basically, did you want to be a priest until you discovered music, or did you go through different iterations of things? How did you get from wanting to be a priest to being a composer?
Yeah, I'm trying to work it. Oh, yeah. After that, it was snooker player for sure. Yeah, because I used to I won a youth club tournament, and I took it as a green light. It's like the only thing I'd ever won, and I remember my gran being really supportive of me for it, and we had sort of a bonding thing over that, and then the same year, that summer, it was the 1985 final, and everyone was watching with Steve Davis, Dennis Taylor, and snooker was just like this huge thing.
And Steve Davis. Yeah. Dennis Taylor used to wear the upside down glasses.
Yeah, he's the guy with the glasses. Yeah, the Irish guy. Yeah, and everyone was just egging on Dennis to win, and it was just classic black ball game at the end, and he was totally behind the day before, and I was just like, this was like box office stuff. And then we look at it now, I know it's like I'm really struggling to still be into it. I still really like snooker, but I'm sort of slightly having to force myself. Ronnie O'Sullivan's the only kind of jaw dropping. He's a bit like Hendrix. Watching Hendrix, you're just like, there's something really emotive about watching that level of ability. Brilliance. And flow. Again, it's a flow state. That like, there's this. We just before you started recording, we were talking about flow states, and those are really good examples of two people who are living that flow thing.
Yeah. Well, I suppose there's personality as well, isn't it? There's, personality within sports. You sort of think of thinking going back, but like the John McEnroes, the sort of Eric Cantonars, Steve Davis was a bit of a joker, but Ronnie O'Sullivan certainly even now is like a real personality within the sport, and it kind of creates this sort of mystique and sort of magic around them. But yeah, he's something else, isn't he, Ronnie O'Sullivan, when you watch him? Yeah,
and it's like the brilliance, so the charisma with the brilliance. So you had people like Higgins or Jimmy White who are also brilliant, and I don't think there's something about Ronnie O'Sullivan who's kept it going for a huge amount, and just is a genius with it, and just seems to. And I sort of elevate the consciousness of the whole sport, or like Hendrix with a guitar, or like you're saying Cantona or someone like that. It's everything's different afterwards. It's like now loads of players play with left hand and right hand, because that's what O'Sullivan does, and no one was even thinking about doing that, and there was the best players ever at the time, and now loads of people are doing it. It's just stuff like that, and just the effortlessness. I mean, you watch it and you're like, this is a hard sport. Or watching Federer play tennis, it's just like so balletic. There's something more. So yeah, I've just like, I think that's a really fascinating thing with music. You can totally get there with flow states and just being on the edge of your ability, but not too far, and just slightly riding that wave of insights, which we all know that feeling, and it's just like this just beautiful feeling and it's kind of elusive. Yeah.
Well, we'll definitely dig into flow state because it's something I'm kind of very interested in. How did the progression go then from Cardinal to Ronnie O'Sullivan to music, composing for film and TV?
So the music thing was a pure get into a band at school thing. One of my mates who I'm still friends with today, actually the two people that I had that we started the band with, that are still two of my oldest friends who I see regularly, and he bought a really cheap bass amp and a bass, and we sort of said, right, who's going to play bass, who's going to play drums, who's going to play guitar? I got the guitar. The guy who bought the bass got the drums and gave the bass to my other mate, and that was it. We were just started rehearsing, and just we set ourselves a date for a school gig. At the end we were about to leave school, so we would have been like 15, 16. And we were like, okay, let's play a gig at the end of school in this end of school party. And we did, and it was about 6 months away. None of us knew how to play anything. And I think the recording still exists, and we still didn't know how to play anything.
Even on the night.
Yeah. But it was so exciting, and it was just like, oh, this is just the coolest thing. And I felt like after school, I felt supreme pressure about like work. No one really prepared me about jobs and work and the idea of you might have to do a job you hate for the rest of your life, and that really freaked me out. So it's sort of that coincided with, right, I've got to do music. Right from that moment, that was it. It was just like, I can't not do this. I've got to do something I like.
But obviously, so there you were playing live, whereas the world of a sort of like a TV film composer is generally one of isolation and sort of less recognition. So where was the switch from sort of like that buzz of kind of being on stage to tucked away in a man cave for sort of days, weeks, months at a time?
Yeah, that was all to do with nerves, actually. I was really bad with stage fright. I did a lot of gigs where I was singing and stuff, and the trauma of before going on and all that. And also the idea of being famous was always a bit, you kind of want to be, I felt like I wanted to be successful in doing it, in doing something, but that fame might be weird. And I always thought of a film TV composer as being slightly behind the scenes, but doing a really cool job, but none of the baggage that comes with being famous. But
I know, I definitely associate with that, because I did the singer-songwriter thing for quite a while and got to a point where I realised that, I don't know, there's some people almost thrive on that nervous energy before going on stage, whereas I was someone who I didn't thrive on it at all. I sort of actually disliked it to the point where I was asking myself, okay, why are you doing this? I never really wanted to be a performer. It's actually someone told me, if you want to do music, you've got to be able to play live, which as an artist is true, but not as a producer or composer necessarily. So
yeah, what would happen to you? Like, because I remember having to just do these breathing exercises and stuff like that, and I would do whole gigs with my eyes closed. Like entire gigs, and then sort of open them between songs or whatever. Oh man, yeah, it's hard.
Well, we once recorded the first ever music video that we recorded. It wasn't really a music video; it was like a live video, and I was blown away by how petrified I looked. I was literally staring into space, one spot on the wall. There was no emotion on my face whatsoever, just going through the motions. And it's only when I sort of saw myself filmed, and it was my cousin who was editing the video, and he was having real troubles basically sort of trying to find angles where my face wasn't apparent, because I just looked petrified, which was an eye-opener, and it obviously opened up doorways for me to sort of work on that, but I don't think I ever truly felt. But at the same time, at the same time I was gigging, Ed Sheeran was gigging a lot of the same venues around sort of Finsbury Park in London, and even Michael Kiwanuka. Now, those were two guys who I saw live in a pub. Now, when you're playing live in a pub, most people just sort of talk through your music. But when those guys played, everybody stopped. And I kind of just realised, I was like, there's a kind of a magic there. Maybe even that, you talk about flow state, I just think I will never have that. As much hard as I practice and what have you, I will never have that flow state when performing live that they have. And they were just sort of captivating.
Yeah, it's funny. You notice the ones, don't you, as well? You notice the ones at the time that are, because I did a lot of gigs as well, yeah, and you're just like, oh shit, yeah. that is someone that it's like, oh, it's a bit sort of simultaneously wow and oh shit.
Yeah.
And that's quite an interesting journey as well, that whole, okay, I think I'm failing at this bit, but you can sort of shift it to something else. Again, like you say, you can shift it into a positive. Well, I know this about myself. Where can I point now? And that's an embodied experience rather than an intellectual one. You can think it as much as you like, but until you've been in situations where you're failing, or where you're just like, I'm not up for that challenge, but I'm definitely up for this challenge, and that's a good journey to be on, I think.
Did you study music at university? Did you go to college?
No,
or university?
No. That's the main source of my imposter syndrome, I'd say. For years I was a bit worried about that, but I just kept on telling myself Paul McCartney, Danny Elfman, all these names which were blazing the trail of especially, and it's because film and TV music is tied up with the word composer as well, which always had this idea of the painting and the quill, the mat, yes. Doing things in the conservatoire type thing, and just using that word just felt sticky for so many years for me. And then I think you just get over it, don't you? You realise, I think I might be a bit experienced now, and it's okay. There's these brilliant musicians who are around to help you if you can't notate, and then that's something I've only recently embraced, actually, with the LCO stuff, and obviously Ben Corrigan, who he's this sort of ball of energy and enthusiasm, and sort of having him in sessions and stuff, and then just realizing, why haven't I done this? Like, just embrace the idea of working with musicians and getting scores prepared from the stuff I've written. So that sort of the idea of sort of outsourcing different elements of the composer's role, or sort of like the musical role, that's a fairly recent thing. Before that, you would just try and do everything yourself. Yeah, literally in a room, isolated, or not sort of being scared to collaborate and stuff like that. But I had a really kind of epiphany moment. I did a session at Angel with LCO. I was doing a short film. Actually, Ben was like, "Why don't you use the LCO?" I was like, "Okay, cool." And I just booked 7 players. I had a small budget, and there was a load of, at the end of it ended up being hardly any music in the film, and there was this whole afternoon session booked with all these players. And so I brought along these piano improvs I'd done and just said to Ben, look, just block out the chords for the musicians. And then I would sort of say to them, okay, play crotchets, choose a note from a triad, play crotchets, and then just do all these different takes where this feel was evolving. And I became really emotional because the music that was coming out was mine, but it was also just had this added aliveness to it from all these super experienced masters of their instruments, responding emotionally to something, and it was evolving, and I was like, okay, this is it for me. This is what I'm going to do now, and that's basically a lot of my records. Of the film score I did was based on that process. A lot of it, as much as it could be if you're in a super tight schedule.
Yeah, sure. And just to touch on. Well, I mean, we'll definitely come back to the material you did with the LCO. You mentioned imposter syndrome. Is that something that's confined to the past now, or is it something that's still there and you just have a handle on it?
It's always there. I think it's tied up with the self, the work on the self, which is an entire lifetime's thing. And I think for any artist, as you know, it's like, well, there's nothing and then there's something, and there's always a question mark about and I think there has to be during the process, is this any good? Some days the same piece you can answer, oh my God, no. And then the other day you can hear it and go, oh no, this is great. And that sort of objective versus being in it and then being objective about it is just this constant process. And I think the only thing that makes the imposter syndrome dwindle is just the knowledge that you've been there before and got through it, so that's the sort of a confirmation thing. So I guess in answer, it does dwindle, yeah, actually. Yeah. But I think it never really goes. But it's like it can become a positive thing. It becomes a sort of a signpost of experience. It's like, no, I know I'm going to have doubts, and that's just inevitable. That's an inevitable part of the process. Sure.
Yeah, I was recently introduced to the concept of the inner bastard. otherwise known as the inner critic. But it's that internal dialogue sort of on repeat, sort of second guessing everything you do. And you just touched on it there. At times, when it comes to sort of reflecting and looking at, assessing whether something is good or not, that inner critic is actually really valuable. But when you're trying to get into flow state and be creative, is a liability. So in that instance, it's silencing the inner bastard, or just sort of listening to him and going, yeah, there, off you go. And then as and when you need him, bring him back.
Yeah. Yeah, oh God, that really that's a great term, the inner bastard, because it suggests there's something going on with a shadow there. So it can be nasty, and it can actually bite you as well. It can be too nasty and just say you're shit, oh no, and then, and then there's a sort of downward spiral. Or it can just be this truth thing that you're kind of would rather ignore, but is just a harsh truth. And that's when it's kind of, and if you can integrate that, it can just be such an asset. Yeah.
And so, going back to that kind of first session with the London Contemporary Orchestra, whereby there was obviously an epiphany for you, and there was an element of disillusionment, but within that moment or during that project, you kind of rediscovered something. Yeah,
for sure. I think it was the real start of a rediscovery of, and a lot of it was. I alluded to it a minute ago about just spending sort of the last 20 years in a room on my own and not really collaborating, and the importance of relationships as well. And I think I just really viscerally felt that in that day. I just felt, this is what they bring, and this is something that's actually really integral to life as well. It's not just so. That really felt me, and I'd been doing a lot of projects just for money as well, because I'd had a baby. So 2011, Sam was born, and this would have been like 2015, 2016, 2017, all this. So about 2015 maybe. And I'd just been work, saying yes to everything, regardless of whether it was a really inspiring project or another daytime TV show, which I should say I was glad I really did. I mean, I got some really good chops in terms of the amount of different styles of music I had to do for certain projects I was doing. But I was basically not connected to it in any way. I was just like, this is just a job, isn't it? I'm sitting in a garden, sitting in a room on my own, doing music I probably wouldn't do if it wasn't for the fact that it's my job. And I sort of made a conscious effort to not do that anymore, and I started listening to music for enjoyment again, which had sort of slipped actually. And I think this was around the time I met you, wasn't it?
Yeah, I think so.
Because I think you're right. I completely forgot actually that I was really quite disillusioned then, and I got myself a real piano in the studio, and made sure I started playing a lot of piano. As guitar was my first instrument, and I was getting a bit. I remember John Lennon said a really good thing about it, like all of his late Beatles early solo stuff was piano, a lot of piano, and it's because he didn't know how to play it. And it's like with the guitar, he was just finding himself going to the same things again, and he was surprising himself more on that. And I love that. I love that about Joni Mitchell as well. She had like 50 different guitar tunings. The idea of you sort of don't know what you're doing every time you pick up the instrument keeps you interested. It's like you're playing with a toy every time.
Yeah,
which is really like, and I sort of went into that with the piano a bit, and I had this sort of barometer of when I was playing something, just whenever I felt moved by something, that was my sign. I was like, I'm just going to go with that. I'm connected to something, to this otherness. I don't know what it is. And then that I would use that as a sort of barometer to pursue a piece of music, to finish it, and just really care about what the music sounded like, and how I was connected to it, and just exploring what that whole thing is, that beautiful mystery of music, and in a similar way that art and poetry is. It's just that it connects you to some other form of reality that we can never use language for, or we can never really explain. And just reconnecting to that again, which is a sort of just remembering what it was like when you first did it before it became a job. And I think, sure. And what was really affirming about that is that I did that, and I put out a couple of records, and that's when I got my first feature film, and on the back of someone hearing that, and it was like, wow, I'm just doing just being genuine, really.
Yeah.
Rather than chasing stuff, and that's what brought it. And there's a real there's so many paradoxes in that sort of stuff that you can. It's sort of the only way is to not really chase it, and be genuine.
Interesting.
Yeah,
it's interesting because I certainly think because I'm quite late to music with my sort of checkered career of various things before sort of quitting it all to do music, and I certainly remember thinking that all of a sudden doing it professionally changes your relationship with it. And it sounds like, I wonder if this is a sort of common thing, but as you say, you got to a point where you sort of something broke, something snapped, and you sort of went back to a place where you're like, okay, let's go back to why I started doing this in the first place, rediscover that sort of that passion. It sounds like it's massively improved your relationship with music, because as you say, you're now writing from a place of like, okay, does this move me? Do you think your musical output has improved as a result of that?
Yeah, for sure. I feel like that's the only place I want to be now. That's the only valid place. It's kind of like, well, if we're here for a short period of time, I'm going to do it properly or not at all. I'm going to do something which means something. It feels really connected to meaning.
Have you? Because obviously some people talk about writer's block. I don't necessarily subscribe to writer's block. It's, if you're a musician, you have to make music, and waiting for inspiration to strike isn't the way you do it. You get started and then inspiration. Have you sort of got tools that help you kind of get into, because you talked about flow, or get into a state whereby you can write better, or you can find that flow quicker?
There are definitely, like when you're on a film and TV thing and you've got a deadline, there are tricks like if you've got 20 cues to do or whatever, it's probably a good idea to only spend 1 hour on each cue, no more than 1 hour. Don't get bogged down. And the importance of having a break, of like, you get way more achieved if you have a break after 3 hours than if you were to plow through. That sort of first half hour back, you have so many more insights than if you'd have just struggled on because you've got so much to do in it. And so those are sort of tricks. But I think it is a really fascinating topic, this sort of, because I think when you're not constrained by deadlines like a lot of projects have, if you're doing your own music, I think it's so different to. I've had to really relearn that I haven't got deadlines. Like, I mean, it's good that I've got a work ethic from that. So I feel like if I'm not getting things done, not progressing, that's a good thing to be used to.
Yeah.
But also just having faith that if I'm stuck on a piece, something will emerge. And it will emerge. It's all going on in your subconscious. You care about the piece, you do. You can't force it. And you might find like a week later, you fire that one up again and you're like, all the answers are there, or not. But just knowing that I still care about this piece, it's not there at the moment. And I love that process, that faith in the emergence of something. But also, there is something also related, which is completely paradoxical to that, is one of my favourite philosophers, polymath, amazing guy called Ian McGilchrist. I went to see a lot of his lectures, and I managed to be super lucky and sit next to him at this meal. And I was talking to him about just being in a really low point, about like, I'm getting up and just not feeling like I've got any purpose. Again, this meaning thing, this like, why am I showing up? And he said, well, just show up, literally just show up. A little bit like sort of, I think what you were just asking me,
Stephen Pressfield talks about it as resistance. Yeah.
So, and I don't, even though I was feeling low, there were some periods, I don't know how many people go through this, but we have our ups and downs, and there are some days where I just feel like I just don't want to be doing it. But even those days, I made sure I had the piano set up with the mics all ready to go, and I just said to myself, okay, part of my routine is a 20-minute improv on the piano every day. Oh. And I think I was just half asleep during most of them, because it was just a routine. I wasn't even thinking about it. And after about 6 months, I reviewed some pieces, and there were those sort of passages of real coherence, like for maybe a minute. And you're like, okay, something happened there. And I just don't know. I don't know, remember feeling they were coherent. But listening back, they felt, and that was the genesis of my flow states piece, because it was like, this is a real rich idea so I did like I edited a lot of those, made them into solo pieces, but also explored doing that with other musicians, and then explored doing it like a hybrid where you've done an improv, and then you score out certain parts for musicians to play, and then they've played the scored out bits, and then they improv on top of it as well. And there's this sort of hybrid. Is this composed? Is this improvised? And that's just really fascinating. And I've gone off on a divergent thing there, but I think it's really related to just sort of showing up. And I don't know what it's related to, but
no, and is that 20-minute improv? You sort of, is that kind of like early in the morning? Is that kind of first thing that you were doing that, or?
I was just making sure that it happened every day. So usually, because I'm not great, and when I'm in that state, I'm not great with early mornings, but I am great at coming into the studio at least, to sort of pretend I'm working. So I'd basically just do that. Yeah, whenever I was in the studio, I was like, okay, here's my 20 minutes.
Yeah, I love that. It's interesting because, have you ever heard of morning pages?
No, what's that? It's
the idea that when you wake up, first thing in the morning, you basically sort of sit down for 20 minutes, half an hour, and you just write. It just can be kind of incoherent stream of, but you just write. And I heard that. I did try it for a while, and it was quite a dark time in my life, and I didn't quite like what I was sort of reading back to myself. But I had this idea at the beginning of the year, is like, could you do that musically? Sort of like literally, so in the morning, get up, first thing you do, sit down, a bit like you're doing, but sit down at your sort of keyboard or whatever for just 30 minutes and just write something for the bin. And it's as if, like, it doesn't matter. I'm just going to noodle around with some ideas, and if it's complete rubbish, I'll just throw it away. But it's almost the idea of sort of getting the crap out of the way before you properly sit down. But then at the same time, it sounds like what you're saying is actually, when you listen back to some of those things, it's like, actually, there's some nuggets of gold here that you don't even remember. So I love that idea.
That's really cool. What you just said, that really reminds me, because I was talking to someone, just telling someone recently that I'm having loads of dreams recently. I'm not a huge dreamer, and I'm just having these really visceral kind of dreams. And they were saying exactly that. It sounds like the morning pages. Like, if you just write down, even if you're half asleep, just what happens in them. Apparently there's some real key insights in all of that stuff, and that relates to I guess it does relate to that showing up thing and just doing stuff. There's this whole idea that 99% of our consciousness is subconscious, and so there's so much going on there.
That's kind of Jungian psychology.
Yeah.
It's fascinating, and then by tapping into that, we're going to come on to talking about flow state, but you mentioned flow state a few times as well, and there's talk about microdosing psilocybin is a good way to sort of tap into the subconscious, and there's that flow state. So actually, maybe flow state lies somewhere between conscious and subconscious, and actually by tapping into the subconscious, that's where the crazy.
I think there's a reason why the psychedelic renaissance and the conversations around philosophy and flow states that they are chiming with each other now again. It's really coming back, and it is a superbly fascinating, just rich vein of stuff.
Amazing, yeah. Right, well, I think this is probably a good time to go under the skin. Under the skin. You mentioned sort of like that idea of deadlines, and the process is slightly different when you've got hard deadlines and there's people waiting for stuff. You did a film, What They Had, that Hollywood moment, which a few years ago now, but just sort of interested in sort of touching on that, because I seem to remember when that came through, not only did you sort of, were you scoring a film, which is a big ask, but you had relatively little time to do it in. Talk us through the sort of process for that, and then I'm interested in sort of afterwards, then sort of maybe looking at a little bit more about the process of writing your own music. But what was the kind of process from having that first meeting to then sort of getting ideas down and ultimately sort of scoring the film?
Yeah, well, it was on the back of one of my records that came out. Someone from Decca who had published it reached out. So the music supervisor, who was Mary Ramos, she's an amazing supervisor. She does all of Tarantino's films. It's just done hundreds.
So unfortunately, at this point in the interview, we lost Danny's audio, but I can fill you in as to what he said. So music supervisor Mary Ramos reached out to Decca, with whom Danny has published, asking if they had anyone who could score their film. They forwarded Danny's album on to the director, who loved it. By this time, it was August of that year, and everything was looking good. But Danny heard nothing. Apparently in the background there were some music publishing issues going on, which needed to be resolved before they could proceed. Anyway, Danny eventually received a copy of the film, fully edited with a temp score.
And it's a really beautiful film, actually, just sort of an ensemble piece. And it genuinely moved me. As soon as I was finished with it, I went into the studio and tried to respond, just to record on the piano and respond. Played around with some themes and responses. And at that moment, the director called me for the first time. And I was snivelling, actually, because I was a moving film and I'd cried and I said, I'm still really moved by your beautiful film. And she was just really chilled and supportive and just like...
The audio cut again. But anyway, Danny and director Elizabeth Chomko continue their conversation about the film and felt really good about going forward. Then cue another long period of nothing happening. The job was finally confirmed in the first week of December of that year, and it needed to be delivered before Christmas, and it was very music heavy.
But so within that time, I had to do like 20 cues, organise musicians, book studios, of which there were just none available right before Christmas. It was really weird. I managed to get a small session at Angel, small session at Air at Adele with 4 or 5 players at a time. But again, like the eureka moments in those ones were I knew I wanted to leave time for improv, and they were the best moments. So there's this really good cellist with LTO called Max Ruizi, and he improved a line over a really delicate piece. It's literally a 2-note phrase which just lifted the cue at the right moment, and I was like, I needed that. Thank you. And it's like, and just leaving the door open for these things, and you've basically created the whole situation for that, the circumstances for that to happen in, and encouraged it. And I think when it comes off, it's so gratifying to just. And then when I'd finished that cue and a couple of others, the director phoned and said, "Thank you so much. This is just what that scene needed." And so that process was, but yeah, it was so fraught, but also like super exciting. And
was it? It sounds like it was, whilst there was all the fraughtness of booking studios, etc. But the actual process of making the music, did that happen quite quickly, and was that effortless?
Yeah, I think it did, actually. I knew that a lot of solo real piano stuff was needed, quite delicate stuff. I mean, I'd be lying if I said it was chilled, because I just was so panicked. In fact, I was are you aware of this list going around of film composers that have been fired? It's like there's like 500. It's basically everyone who have been fired multiple times on films, and it's this idea that you haven't arrived as a film composer unless you've been fired. And the entire process, I was waiting to be fired. Like imposter syndrome, huge. Like this is, I've got the job, but here's where they find out. It's like, and also just the stress of getting through that amount of work was just really was. So it was fraught. Yeah.
And which cue was it that you mentioned that had that improvised cello line in it? Because I'm going to link to everything that we mentioned in the conversation. I'm going to link to in the show notes, but it'd be nice to just sort of link.
Yeah, there's just a 2-note cello phrase in I think the cue was called "Power of Attorney," which is so dull, isn't it, as a title? But yeah,
it's funny because in my conversation with Stephen Warbeck, he talked about getting fired. He actually got fired from a job before he even started it. It's just hilarious.
That's an extra achievement.
But yes, I think it's obviously something that's more common than people realise, because obviously as a composer, it's not something you generally shout about. But I think that's something that also sort of petrifies me, because it's quite difficult to separate yourself from from that. Your identity is sort of wrapped up in being a composer, and if you get fired, it's sort of like all of a sudden you're questioning whether or not you are a composer, and then ultimately your sort of identity. So it's
and I think that extends into life, doesn't it? Just your identity being wrapped up with your career, and especially with careers that are so hard and so competitive and so take so long to get any traction in. It's really hard to separate your well-being from how well your career is going, and it's psychologically, it's a real conscious struggle for me. Actually, I'm disentangling my identity with how well things are going with work.
Yeah, and so it was this project where you had more studio time booked than you needed, which led to the improv session, which led to the kind of like the birth of your.
No, that was a short film about 2 years earlier. So I'd already had.
Okay.
Again, it was these LCO players. There's Rob Ames, Galia, and a brilliant cellist called Ollie Coates, and Ben Corrigan as well, who was really good at sort of score prepping and just knew the LCO people really well. So it was those people were in place then. I was like, well, I know I want these people. Please let them be available.
So just quick question there, because this is something else that's come up, is what was it about the LCO that was made you so keen to use them versus, anyone else?
Yeah, in that first session I had with them, they were just utterly open. There was no, because I always had this fear, and we were just talking about it, like the reason I mentioned them was that's the first time I used classical musicians was because I had this imposter syndrome, the idea that I couldn't be telling trained musicians what to do or what are the rules. I haven't got the rule book for this. I didn't go to a conservatoire or whatever. I really did. It was stupid. I was just lacked confidence for a very long time. And I found that they are just a sort of brand of personality. Rob is this just sort of what you see is what you get, very chilled out, very experimental, eclectic music taste, just happens to be conductor and viola player for a brilliant orchestra. And it's just like, it was like working with a musician that I would have worked with if I was in a band. It just felt like that. And not only that, he was just encouraging experimentation. Like those were the bits that really was rather than going through the motions reading scores, it was like, oh, let's have some fun. There was one point where they were just doing, I think Ollie had tuned one of his cello strings down to barely nothing, super slack, and the bass clarinetist was sort of just doing this weird spitting thing, percussive thing into the we just went off in these just loads of tangents and stuff, and that stuff like they were just really gunning for that, and I was like, this is too left field for me. I can't, but that's it's really great to know that they just want to do stuff like that, and I just felt completely like, wow, this is definitely the way to do things,
Yeah,
and I felt allowed and more comfortable. Like I really got the sense that they probably sensed that I was a little bit nervous, and that I think they really wanted me to feel comfortable, which felt really great. Like I felt like I was in good hands as well.
Yeah,
I
think that's same with a good sort of mix engineer and a good producer is somebody who makes you feel comfortable, because quite often you've gone in there off the back of weeks and weeks of preparation. There's a question mark at the back of your mind going, all right, when they play this, is it going to sound as good as it does on my mock-ups? And there's the time constraint as well. So if you've got someone to just sort of go, hey, don't worry, I've got this, you're in good hands. And it sounds like amazingly that actually the LCO were also a part of that equation, which is amazing.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. The people, again, it's about relationships. People matter. People.
Yeah.
And I think they're kind of prior to the people, the relationships are prior to the, that's so important, that dynamic between the space between people. And it's like you say, everyone involved, engineers, you can really see it in, have you seen Get Back? Like one of the revelations for me was watching Glyn Johns, the engineer. I mean, everybody, like if you're a Beatles geek, you know who Glyn Johns is, but watching him now, after all these years without all this footage, there's this, he's just a revelation in how much he brought to those sessions, and yeah,
amazing. Yeah, it's the whole entourage. And it sounds like as well that you feel that the end product, that the kind of leveraging the talents of musicians around you ultimately leads to a better end product than if you were to sort of be doing it all yourself.
Yeah, and not only that, it's more than the sum of the parts as well. So again, the relationship seems to make something emergent that's more. It's more, and it really is. And I think, yeah, it's fascinating.
Okay. Amazing. And so, okay, so we've got kind of like an understanding of the sort of the process for that, which is maybe the sort of more traditional project. But you're currently working on a John Vervaeke project, which is somewhat different in terms of structure, process. Should you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, no, this is really floating my boat, and just because it's so unusual. Basically, John Vervaeke, I imagine most people won't know. Some people will, I guess. He's a professor of cognitive science at the University of Toronto. He's got this YouTube series called Awakening from the Meaning Crisis, and also multiple interviews. He's not just a cognitive science. He's a philosopher, and is a massive expert on wisdom traditions and stuff. So this Awakening from the Meaning Crisis has got just a crash course on philosophy, cognitive science, just everything, religion, culture.
And what is, if you just sort of, and obviously I know it's probably a subject you could go hugely down a rabbit hole in, but just briefly, what do we mean by the meaning crisis?
Yeah, I was hoping you wouldn't ask me that. It's like, it's been called the meta crisis, the sense making crisis, just this feeling of bewilderment that everyone has at the moment, like Trump, Capitol building, Brexit, polarization, social media, truth, post-truth, like what's true now, the whole COVID vaccine thing, like what's going on? And it's a crisis, it's a genuine crisis. But I think also the meaning part of it is connected to do with the wisdom traditions that are no longer really in our culture. Like, it's quite strange. Like, so even though religion clearly has its problems, but there's what baby has been thrown out of the bathwater, because we've clearly lost religion in us. Most people don't go to church anymore. And there are wisdom traditions around the world, like a huge, yoga's huge, Tai Chi's huge, all of that stuff. It's like, what is in that? What is in that? And what's gone from our culture from it? And I think it's way more than people realize, and it's contributing a huge amount to this sort of anxiety crisis or whatever there is going on. And there's so many things. It's super complex, and the whole idea of complexity and the meta, the looking at everything, is a fascinating thing. So there's this guy John Vervaeke who's sort of been tackling that for a long time, and he's done a lot of really important work. And there's this guy called David Fuller, who runs a YouTube channel and a sort of organisation actually, who run courses, called Rebel Wisdom, and he's an ex-journalist, or he is a journalist. He worked for Channel 4 News and BBC, did documentaries and stuff, and him and Rebel Wisdom have been brilliant at curating the sort of best philosophers, cultural commentators, journalists, podcasters, scientists, therapists, just looking at sense making. And John Vervaeke has sort of shone through as one of these kind of main guys that people resonate with. So they're just trying to work. David's trying to set up a project where he's going to make a documentary about John's work, and he's reaching out. What's fascinating about the project is he's reaching out to people who know his work, so scientists, philosophers, so some really sort of galaxy brain people. But also animators who are really aware of his work, and myself doing the music. I mean, this is super early stages, and so we have these sort of really interesting Zoom calls, and what's a way into this stuff. And also, what David is brilliant at is talking about his awareness of the mainstream media, what he sort of calls the legacy media, versus. So he's now got a successful YouTube channel and is making really high quality, nuanced stuff, a bit like, long form podcasts and stuff. on the new media, which seems to be so out of sight of the mainstream. And he's sort of saying, okay, so what would a Netflix version of John Vervaeke documentary look like, and what would be a way in, and what can all these people... So it's like this, loads of clever people doing something quite punk and trying to make a film about, like, how do you make this accessible? How do you get people really into this? And it's just really floating my boat, because I'm really interested in those conversations. And, you know...
Well, as far as Netflix is concerned, having tigers in it could be useful.
Yeah, that was grim, wasn't it?
It was, yeah. That, I suppose there's quite a lot of sort of meaning crisis sort of in the Tiger King, yeah.
Yeah.
It's funny, the Tiger King, I think this is the second episode of the podcast where the Tiger King's come up. I don't know whether that says a lot about me and my relationship with it.
Well, it was fascinating, isn't it? What a weird guy.
Yeah,
and that whole murder thing. But I think there's something in that, like the Social Dilemma was the most viewed Netflix doc. And then there was something by David Baddiel recently about social media. And this is all connected to Rebel Wisdom and what they talk about, the polarization of social media. And Russell Howard recently had Jordan Peterson on. So that's Jordan Peterson going into mainstream comedy, which is he's quite a very interesting figure. I'm definitely not a Petersonian, philosophy. I think there's a lot of flaws in his, but he was such an interesting figure in terms of the culture war and all that stuff.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I find it really fascinating.
Yeah. So, I mean, it sounds like with this John Vervaeke process that, perhaps traditionally with a film, somebody comes to you, maybe once the script has been written, if you're lucky. If not, when they've kind of nearly finished shooting and they suddenly go, oh God, we need some music. But with this, it's almost like the concept has been created and they're sort of having the composers almost like be a part of creating the concept itself.
That's the thing, yeah. The concept sort of hasn't been... The idea of wanting this guy's... that this is important stuff, and why is it getting missed? And then what can these group of people do to make it come about? I mean, it literally is new ground for me. I've never. But it's fascinating because I always thought it was a really wise thing in the NFT. The NFTS, where they would make like if you did the composing course there, you would have to spend the first year learning how to make films and different disciplines of filmmaking, and how that really informs your entire sort of knowledge of your own job and your own speciality. It's integrated in a sort of holistic way. And I feel like this project is a really fascinating way of doing that, but also in a sort of punk spirit as well, because there's definitely a lot of people who have never made films. There's a lot of people who are also experienced in film and media as well, and just sort of pulling all that together and seeing what the hell's going to... I don't know. I'm excited to do it. But I haven't got a lot to say on the process yet because I'm sort of in it in the super early stages. Yeah.
Well, I suppose it also ties in with what you were talking about earlier, that kind of the idea that the synergy of having multiple people all coming together to sort of create something is hopefully that end product will be, certainly very different to what it would have been if it was just the brainchild of one person, but then hopefully, maybe sort of better for it as you've got wisdom from different people from different walks of life. It sounds like you've got psychologists, philosophers, everyone involved. And so like the end product, I mean, yeah, wow. I think probably the challenge is like taking all of that input and distilling it down into something
simple and accessible. That's the key. Like what would hook people into this and why would they feel excited about it? Because it's super complex. It's a talk, and I have to say it's not really my job to be doing that, but if I can do some part of it with music, that's helpful along that. I've been just going to be fascinated in the whole process, basically.
Yeah. Well, it certainly ties in as well with what you were saying earlier about, does it mean something? Are you sort of excited and inspired by it? And it certainly sounds like it's right up your street in terms of subject matter and even the kind of the process of creating it.
Yeah, honestly, and I didn't know whether to talk about it with you because this is a sync, film music, media music podcast, and it's like, well, I don't even know how much music there's going to be in it, but I really care about whatever music there is in it, and I also really care about the this particular topic and this particular film and how it gets made. And as a composer, I think that's a really important part of your job and career as well is like we were talking about that before, where you don't want to be phoning it in all your life. You want to sort of be involved in things, and if your bit of the puzzle is relevant to that, that's great. That's, you know, I feel that that's really important.
Yeah, but then also recognizing if it doesn't require music, or that also taking a step back, and rather than going, oh yeah, you definitely put some music in here, because if it doesn't need it, actually that's kind of a really important decision as well.
I've been on all the emails. You've got to have some music. It's just
spend a lot of time reading your emails and listening to these calls, like getting a taste. I always think that, you know, as creatives, we're hugely influenced, probably in the sort of more formative years of our lives as children, teenagers, whatever, by the music that we listen to, that we consume. What are kind of some of the seminal pieces of music or albums? There could be songwriters and artists as well as sort of any sort of like film composers. But can you sort of trace almost a chronology of influences, that people that have really influenced you and helped? You know, I suppose it doesn't even necessarily need to shine through in the music that I suppose it will in some way, but it doesn't, not to say, you know, it's going to be the same as what you're doing now. But that's a long-winded way of saying, what are your influences, Dan?
There's loads. I would say primarily, you know, sort of 60s, 70s. You know, as a kid, I mean, the Beatles were so accessible to children. I'm noticing it with my own child. They did Beatles Rock Band on the PlayStation and stuff, and he's getting it. He's getting just they're so accessible. There's so much energy to their early stuff, and the whole sort of shift they did to some more experimental stuff and complex stuff, and they're a fascinating band just generally to just look at the culture of music through, and like how they influenced culture and how culture influenced them. And this sort of explosive. I love the idea of the Brian Eno concept of scenius. There's a scene which, because there's so many people doing it, it has its own genius. It has its own sort of like. He likened it to a lot of Russian abstract art, and he was like, he knew about 20 artists who were doing it. Then he went to St. Petersburg and just saw hundreds, and there was this scene of. And so people talk about Kandinsky, but he was one of like hundreds of people. And it was, the art was so good because it was like a kind of collective intelligence, which was raising. Yeah, and I feel like the 60s has got so much of that going on through the Beatles and, you know, people like Joni Mitchell, Bob Dylan as well. Like I found myself returning to the Beatles and Dylan a lot recently. I'd completely not been listening to them for years. I've been into sort of film music, and, you know, I was into Johan Johansson for quite a bit, and a lot of just sort of listening to film music and relating it to my career and sort of. But I'd say my primary influences are sort of singer-songwriters, bands like the Beatles. I got heavily into U2 in the sort of early 80s and their early albums, and then sort of when I was about 14 or 15. I think it was about 14 maybe. I went to see them when on the Joshua Tree tour. Took a day off school, and that's sort of a memory of adventure. And I got a bit obsessed with them. They're an interesting, they're an interesting band. And also, we went to this place. I still don't know quite where it was. Another place I went to at school was this place called the Clubfoot, which was a Clarendon hotel. I think it was in Hammersmith. And we were like 13 or 14. No, definitely no more than 14. Going up and just kind of drinking and sort of losing 2.5 pints of sweat and getting clothes ripped in this sort of mosh pit, watching psychobilly bands.
Right. You made it sound like it was a school trip there. I was like, wow, it was a pretty progressive school you went to.
Yeah, really progressive school, yeah. No, I don't know how any of our parents thought it was okay. I think about my niece who's sort of barely allowed to walk home from school, and and just what a different time that was. But yeah, I was just listening to sort of psychedelic bands like the Meteors, and I wasn't heavily into it. A lot of people at my school were really into the Clash, and going up to London to see the Damned, and so there's that sort of punk thing going on. And I did get into that a bit. I was never heavily into it. So yeah, it's just all that sort of thing really that and you know, that Peter Jackson documentary about the Beatles that came out recently, I just fully went back there. The whole of December I was just immersed in watching them work together and stuff. So that's been, I'd say they're it's kind of a boring one, but they're definitely key. And then later on, I loved songwriters like Roddy Frame from Aztec Camera, Neil Finn from Crowded House. Really love his songwriting. You know, good songwriters. Terry Hall from The Specials did a really good few solo albums in the 90s, which has sort of got lost a bit, but produced by Ian Browdy of the Lightning Seeds. A really good one called Home. It's sort of adult pop stuff. Yeah.
And what about, is there anything kind of modern stuff that's coming sort of out, has been coming out over sort of recently? Is there anything that sort of inspires you?
I really like, I don't know, the FKA Twigs, is that, I really like, is FKA Twigs. I don't even know who they are. I think it's a woman on her own, but the production is kind of super interesting, cutting edge. There's an album a few years ago I got into called LP1. And she's got something new, I think it was last year, came out. I've been really into that, just sonically really interesting. What else? I mean, I was really into the Max Richtery sort of Johansson stuff, because it was tied into I thought it was a really interesting shift in film scoring where there's about maybe 5 years ago, the sort of Zimmer model, which is still happening and still great, was also like a lot of A-list Hollywood films were being done by Johansson, like really big films, and I found that a really interesting shift. And Max Richter came into that, and then artists around Erased Tapes and stuff. I was sort of interested in that for a while. For some reason, I've gone away from that. I don't know if it's because it was a trend or whether I'm just not as interested. But yeah, I was into that for a while. But I'd say now, I'm just anything with interesting production. There's, but it's really hard remembering artists these days, because I've got like about 3 or 4 Spotify playlists which I'm adding to a lot, but I can't remember who the hell's on them. I just like listening to them. It's a really hard thing to talk about, which is terrible for the artists. But
yeah, I totally. And it seems to be the same for everyone. Is like you hear tracks and you don't actually know who they're by. But you know you like them. But yeah, it's the way we consume music. You know, say back in the day, the Beatles, you'd buy albums and you'd consume the whole album, and that album told a story. Whereas now we cherry pick the tracks that we listen to, so it changes our relationship, I suppose.
There's a really good film composer. I met him out in Toronto when I was there, and he was this sort of really unassuming guy. But it turns out he's done loads of stuff. A guy called Rob Simonson. I think he's done the recent Ghostbusters thing, which I confess I haven't listened to or seen. But he's sort of done loads of films in the low key. He does a lot of diverse genres and stuff like that.
Oh, okay.
And also he's also involved with this LA-based sort of art collective called the Echo Collective, and they release records as artists as well. I think he's involved with them. I might be wrong about that. And it sort of appeals as a sort of someone whose career you'd quite like, you know, being a member, having an arts collective side thing and doing some nice films and just being quite chilled with it. And that he seemed quite an inspiring character to me.
Hey, if there's a man who can, Dan, it's you. It sounds like you're kind of on the way already. So,
well, who knows? I mean, it's just it'd be nice to get a nice balance, wouldn't it, with things? But that idea of life-work balance, that seems like another story we tell ourselves, which is what
amazing. Dan, I'm conscious of time. We're sort of we're way over. This has been amazing. There's so much interesting stuff that we've sort of touched on there. We've gone pretty deep, which I knew we were going to do, but is always a good thing. Before we go, I've got a few quick fire questions for you. What scares Dan Mulhern?
Quick fire. God, you won't get that from me. What scares me? Oh God. I would say losing joy, failing to see joy. I mean, I really love depth, but I've got to remember to not take things too seriously sometimes. Yeah.
Well, okay. Well, that sort of maybe ties into the other question, which is, if you could go back in time and give your younger self one piece of advice, what would it be?
Oh. Yeah, fucking loads actually. But there's more time than you think. Don't panic.
Nice. And what's a little known fact about you?
That I guess I once worked on a cruise ship and jumped off. Not jumped off actually.
Man overboard.
I left it with. They keep your passport so you can't leave, but I just had enough because they were phoning me so much in the sort of in the winter when I was penniless in London and saying, "Can you fly out to Miami and do another?" And it was just sort of really. I wasn't qualified for it. I was awful. I was doing sound and lights for the sort of lounge band. I was terrible, like doing tape cues that never were. And I was just like, "What the hell am I doing?" And in Stockholm, I just like sort of stayed off rather than got back on and watched the ship sail away. And I thought that's one of my sort of small adult rebellions that I ever did, which sort of changed the course of my life, I guess. But that's not a small, I guess, that's something interesting that I did, I guess. But
well, yes, I mean, it's a little known fact. It's this sort of the previous life of Danny Mulhern. Amazing. So yes, trivia. Do you have, because I'm obsessed with sort of random facts about music or TV or movies, do you have a sort of a cool piece of trivia or a little known fact about? Oh
God, I think the one that pops into my mind about films is possibly dull. It's that there's no music in The Birds. That just picks because you always think of Hitchcock as being
Bernard Herrmann.
All the Herrmann scores, which are so iconic, and then there's just no music in The Birds, and it's like, oh, there's no music in The Birds. But I think about that every time now, and I think most people know it.
I didn't. I can't even remember it. It's so long ago that I saw it. Well, that's a cool little thing. Well, that I suppose it's interesting as well because it speaks to the power of not having silence or not having music or sound design or just actually really good performances, and that can in of itself carry a film without the need to sort of underscore and underpin certain emotions. So yeah. Amazing. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to chat, Danny. If people want to find you and your work, where do they go?
Oh, okay, yeah. So I've got a website, dannymulhern.com. I think most things are there. All my socials are sort of linked there, and most of my work. Yeah, Spotify and all that stuff.
Amazing. And look out for, in March this year, you've got the first single coming out from Singing Through Others?
Yeah, first single in March. The album comes out in June, but there's singles coming out every other week from March.
Amazing.
Yeah.
And obviously, if anyone's listening to this in the future, then it's out already, so go check it out. Amazing. Dan, thanks so much for taking the time to chat, mate. It's been an absolute pleasure. Good luck with everything, and hopefully I'll see you soon.
Thanks, Jim. That's good to talk to you. Good to catch up.
Thank you very much for listening. If you've enjoyed this episode, and given that you've listened this far, I feel you might have, then I would be honoured and incredibly grateful if you could take a moment to subscribe, rate and review on your podcast platform of choice. By subscribing, you'll automatically be notified each time a new episode drops, and by rating the show, you tell the artificial intelligence that will soon be running the world that this podcast is worth listening to. I certainly get a lot of insights and value from these conversations, and I genuinely hope you do too. If you'd like to get in touch with the show, then you can email me, podcast@larkmusic.com. Larkmusic.com is my digital abode, and the home of the podcast is larkmusic.com/Sync Music Matters Podcast. And Sync Music Matters Podcast is hyphenated. Thanks again for listening, and until next time.